Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Zara Altair, and I am the author of the Argolicus Mysteries. And I'm producing this today, especially for the backers of the Grain Merchant Project on Kickstarter. So we're 3/4 of the way through, and I have some wonderful backers. And I thought I'd talk a little bit about the Ostrogoths in Italy because Theodoric was the king of Italy at this time. And um, there's some background that will really help, I think, understand, although I hope that in the stories everything is self-explanatory. Uh, but it's always fun to look a little bit deeper. And so if you can bear with me, I am going to start a screen share. We're going to go to... Okay, so first of all, I want to thank you for being here because without backers, Kickstarter projects just don't happen. So thank you so much for being here. And then I wanted to tell you just a little bit about the Grain Merchant. It's a project on Kickstarter now, and it is a historical mystery set in Ostrogoth, Italy, which was the late 5th and early 6th centuries. These stories take place in the early 6th century. And I want to explain a little bit how Kickstarter works because it's kind of an all or nothing deal. It's a crowd-funded project, so every single backer is part of the crowd. And backers pledge at $1 level to raise funds for the project. And if the goal is reached, the backers are charged their pledge. And the project lasts a certain amount of time. In this case, it's 30 days, 1 month. And we started on January 7th, we end February 6th. So if the goal is reached in time frame, all systems are go, we're on. The manuscript goes off to the editor for the first round of editing. If the goal is not reached by the date, the backers aren't charged and all bets are off. So just a little bit about that. And if you're not familiar at all with Kickstarter, it's pretty easy to sign up. I do not have your personal information. Everything that you give, your name, your email, goes to Kickstarter. I do get your name. I don't have your email. The only way I get in touch with you is through updates on Kickstarter. So, and just for people with privacy concerns, you can do that. And I do have some anonymous backers, so I just wanted to share that with you. So a little bit about the Grain Merchant itself. Argolicus and his lifelong companion and tutor, slave, moved to the town of Scolaci from his villa in the hills. And he enters the new world of politics. He just jumps right in. The first day he's there, he gets invited to the next town meeting. And one of the concerns at the time is an uprising over a food shortage. And also, his mother and another person have tried to set up an arranged marriage, and that doesn't work from the get-go. And you can read more about it in the story. So the world of Argolicus is definitely set in 6th century Italy. And just want to note for this image, I saw this image when I was researching background about the area, and I saw this and I went, oh my gosh, something has to happen here. And that's kind of the seed that started the Grain Merchant, was seeing this image and saying, something's going to happen here. Okay, so a little bit about general history of the time. This is a time when Rome wasn't Rome. The capital of Italy was in Ravenna, and the center of the Roman Empire was in Constantinople. So Rome was a city of patricians uh, without much without much power except within the city itself. So Constantinople was the actual seat of the Roman Empire, and the Ostrogoth king Theodoric ruled in Italy. I just want to talk a little bit about him and what went on and how he's perceived and how Ostrogoths are perceived and how he perceived himself. So the story takes place in the Ostrogoth Empire. You can see all that orange, and then the south is Argalica's home. It's down at the very sole of the boot of, of Italy in the province that was then called Bruttium and is now Calabria. And there were multiple social layers, and these layers come to play in this story. There were people without land or employment, and those are the people who are mainly involved in the uprising in this story. There are people who work. They work for money, like servants or field workers. There are small farmers and growers. They weren't particularly well off. That, like farmers today, they worked really hard. There were the landowners who were the curia, and they were the ones who made political decisions. And there were the major landowners, the principals who guided the rest of the curia, and then the magistrates who were elected from within the principals. Actually, they were elected from within the curia, but the principals pretty much directed who was appointed and elected as magistrate for the year. So a little bit about the social layers, and people familiar with the project will recognize some of these layers in the rewards for the grain merchant. So Theodoric's kingdom was what you see, all the red. It was Italy and stretched off to both the west and the east. So the Ostrogoths actually came, it wasn't exactly an invasion, it was a migration. They came from the Balkans to Italy, and they came actually over the frozen Danube. The river froze, and they went across and came down into Italy and were first in Milan. And um, Theodoric the king is often romanticized in a number of ways, which you can see from these illustrations. And if you go along to gaming sites and role playing, there's a lot of I can't say the word, romanticization of the Ostrogoths. And most of that comes from before they were in Italy. But Theodoric had spent the years from age 10 to 18 as um, mainly a hostage, but he lived in the palace in Constantinople, so he was utterly familiar with how an emperor ruled and what went on in court. And the images that he had of himself, this is a coin from his time, was in the image of an emperor. So he wore rich silks. You can see in this, you can see all the embroidery. He wore red imperial shoes, which were theoretically safe for the emperor. And in this image, you can also see the imperial bread. The king, the emperor, were the source of bread for the people, and his scepter. However, he was still an Ostrogoth, and underneath the cushion of the throne was a human skin to remind him that he made life and death decisions about people. So he was considered at the time a very forward-thinking and civil king. He had what he called civitas, which was uh, the requirement for people to be civil to one another. And so there was no, snarky stuff or bashing or any of those things that we encounter today in our modern world. But civitas was the way that people conducted their lives. And during his time as king, there was a lot of building and land reclamation and actually general prosperity in Italy. And another thing that Theodoric emphasized was religious tolerance, that there was no one religious theology that took precedence over others. Um, and then within Italy at the time, there were two systems, the Ostrogoth and the Romans. So Romans, Italians, um, had one set of laws and one set of people who maintained those laws. And then the Ostrogoths, all the Ostrogoths who lived in Italy had their own system with their own system of enforcers. And two of Theodoric's main known people was his general, Trawilla, who then, when the court was established, became the provost of the sacred bedchamber. I know that doesn't make a lot of sense to us, but mainly he was privy to everything that Theodoric did and was an advisor. And then Cassiodorus, Flavius Magnus Aurelius Cassiodorus, senator, was what we would call the prime minister. And he administered um, the goings on within the kingdom. And one of the ways that we know about him is that he preserved a number of the letters that he wrote for the king called the Varii. And I actually discovered our hero, Argolicus, in the Varii, where he's mentioned 9 times. But very briefly, so everything that we know about his personality in the stories and his heritage is all from my imagination. So even though the country was prosperous, there were conflicts at that time. There was a religious controversy, the Pope in Rome and the Patriarch in Constantinople. And remember, Constantinople was the seat of the Roman Empire, um, had differences over theological interpretations. The Italians, especially in Rome, wanted Italy back. Theodoric went to Rome once for one day. That was it. And the rest of the time he was in Ravenna. So the Romans were kind of out of the loop. They lived in this little bubble in Rome where they were patricians and had their senate and all these traditional, quote, Roman, unquote, things went on, but it wasn't the capital. And so it was very sort of ingrown place. And then in Constantinople, there were factions that were beginning to want Italy back, to take it back from the Ostrogoths and once again make it part of the Roman Empire. It's sort of questionable what was going on at the time. Theodoric said he was appointed by the emperor, but then there was no official like document that said that. So things went on from the 480s into the middle of the 6th century with the Ostrogoths ruling in Italy. So, and then there were, with the Christian divisions, there was a belief that there was one God, and depending on who was emperor at the time, that was sort of the prevailing religion. And then there was the Arian doctrine, which was the Christian doctrine of Theodoric and the people. They did not call themselves Ostrogoths. That's a term that came later by um, archaeologists and the like. They just called themselves the people, and their language was their language, and their religion was their religion, etc. So the Arians believed in the Father and the Son, but there was no Holy Spirit. And then the Romans were in the main Trinitarian and believed in the three-person God. So there was a lot of religious controversy, and often at a local and even at a personal level, where people disagreed over their theological interpretation. So that's kind of a background of what's going on. And then one of the reasons that that information is hard to come by is that in the middle of the 6th century, when um, the Emperor Justinian took back Italy from the Ostrogoths, he tried to erase every evidence of the Ostrogoths, the quote barbarians, ever living in Italy or having any power in Italy. And this hand in Theodoric's chapel is a great example. Originally, people believed that this whole, whoops, oh, I can't go back in this mode, that whole mode was depicted Theodoric and his court, and Justinian had the whole mosaic replaced with curtains. Okay, here we go. And then another major difference between the Ostrogoths and the Romans, Italians, was, when you go to Italy and you see structures from that time, they're all made of stone. But the Ostrogoths actually lived in wooden homes, so they were easily destroyed by time. Anyway, in our story, the king's breadbasket was really southern Italy, where many things were supplied to Italy, and especially up north to Ravenna. So wheat, horses, oil, fish oil, olives, lots of produce. Was a major center of food supplies for the rest of Italy. And if you read, long, big, sweeping history books, you see that food also came from Egypt and other places in Africa. But the South was supplied a lot of food to 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 all of Italy. All right, a little bit. I'm going to narrow in now a little bit on Ostrogoths in this story. So our hero, Argolicus, is half Roman and half Ostrogoth. His father was a patrician, and his mother was an Ostrogoth. And they married at a time when it was questionable but legal for the two to marry. At the time of this story, the marriage between Italians and Ostrogoths was forbidden. So one of the main characters in every story is Ebermuth. He is an Ostrogoth, and he's one of very few who actually live in southern Italy. And he is a character of my imagination. I just needed an Ostrogoth there to represent what was going on in Italy, so I made him up. And if you look at the guy on the horse, that's pretty much very similar to what he would have been like. He was rich. Um, and I think of Vincent Cassel for the energy. That energy, I try to portray his energy and the way his body is always ready for action. I don't know if you've ever seen an interview with Vincent Cassel, but he's just never still. Okay, and then in this particular story, there's two more major characters who are Ostrogoths, and because of the unsettling circumstances at the time, Ebermuth sends Argolicus two bodyguards, and so they're brand new characters that appear in this novel. They're Cunimund and Eberic, and they're big, wild, crazy, armed um, men. And something I should point out, and the need for bodyguards was that at this time Italians, Romans, um, were not allowed to carry arms. The only people who could carry arms under King Theodoric's rule were the Ostrogoths. So even though Argolicus and his tutor practiced martial arts, he he cannot carry arms when he's out and about. So Ebermuth thinks that it's very important that at this time he have these two bodyguards. And so football fans will recognize David Beckham and Adam Bogdan, but I just use them as these energized, very athletic people. So once again, the way you can help today to get this project funded is to go to the Kickstarter site, which is bit.ly link is KS for Kickstarter, the grain merchant. Check out the rewards, choose your backer level, and then back the grain merchant. And some of the rewards are the other Argolicus mysteries. And there's, I'm just going to skip through all these rewards. There's also a backer only cookbook, Food of the 6th Century Italy. It's called The Principles Table. So you learn how to bake bread with a bow, make your own garum, which is that fish sauce, um, a recipe for honeyed wine, a recipe for fish stew, tasty lamb roast, Roman appetizers, which were very prevalent, gustum, and that's a backer only book. And I want to thank you for being here today, and I'm going to stop sharing and take a look at we have here. Okay, so I don't see any questions today. As always, this is an Ask Me Anything. Ask Me Anything. So for the final part, I wanted to read a quick section from the grain merchant where we meet Ebermuth in the story. Argolicus has just left a home, and on his way, he's found a young girl, about 12 or 13, who has run away from home, and he has taken her under his wing, and they are walking down the street from towards his new home in town. He heard the sound of horse hooves on the street and made sure they stayed to the side. The horsemen were calling, "Disperse! Disperse!" The street crowds pushed Argolicus and Severa forward as the horsemen approached. The girl tightened her grip and pressed against Argolicus. He could feel her trembling. "Don't be afraid. The horsemen are trying to clear the streets of all these people. We'll be there shortly. Just stay close and follow me." As the horses drove the people forward, the street filled with people urged on by the shouts of "Disperse." Argolicus said, "We'll stay by the side of the street, out of the way of the horsemen. We'll be there very soon." Severa nodded her head, but her eyes were wide with fear. Argolicus could hear the horses panting now. The crowd pressed on every side. Suddenly a voice called, "Argolicus!" He turned his head. The horsemen were right behind them. In front was a big man with a wild mane of blonde hair guiding his horse with his knees. He pulled on the reins and signaled the men behind him to keep going. He hopped down from the horse and gave Argolicus a hug. Then he pushed back and said in a burst of energy, "What are you doing here? Look at these crowds. Where are you going? Who is this?" He stood surveying the crowd while Argolicus answered, "I'm moving to Father's house. I'm going there now, and this is Severa. She's coming with me." The big man smiled at the girl. "Severa, a nice name. You found one of the best men in all of Bruttium." Severa nodded her head but kept her eyes down. "Now," Ebermuth said, "you need to get home and stay off the streets. Things are getting rough. There was a fire down by the warehouses." "Well, now I have a question," Argolicus said. "Why are you patrolling the streets? Isn't that the work of the peace warden?" "Our friend, Cassiodorus, that's why." The big man moved his shoulders to loosen them. "I've been appointed by the king." "Appointed? What do you mean?" Ebermuth stood his full height, inches taller than Argolicus, and said, "You are looking at the Comus Civitatis. You can call me Count if you like." A big grin spread over his chiseled face, and his energized body seemed ready to bound up or away, filled with drive and vitality. Argolicus smiled at his friends. "Oh, Cassiodorus, leave it to him to remember his childhood friends. Be wary. I was appointed to Rome and wasn't happy. I'm glad to be back here." A new group of ruffians marched toward them, chanting. They saw Ebermuth and his horse and quietly walked past. Silently, they broke up and walked off to the side streets and alleys. Severa gripped Argolicus' hand. She looked up at the tall, blonde Ebermuth. "Don't worry, little one. No one will harm you. You have Argolicus to stand firm and me to defend you." Severa nodded but said nothing. "She's hungry," Argolicus said. "We were on our way to the house to get her some food." Ebermuth raised an eyebrow, wanting to know but not asking. "I just met her," Argolicus said, partially answering the unanswered question, the unasked question. "Aha, we'll be neighbors," Ebermuth said. Severa nodded, then gave him a timid smile. Ebermuth focused his attention back to Argolicus. "You shouldn't be walking the streets. These are unsettled times. I know you're used to your freedoms, but right now you need a bodyguard or two. I'll send you two." "I don't need a bodyguard." "You do. You live with your books. You have no idea what is happening, not just in the streets of town, but on the roads. People are unhappy and groups are turning violent, especially against landowners and the clerics. You can't carry weapons. It's foolish to go without bodyguards. These are troubling times." Argolicus shrugged his shoulders in exasperation at his friend. Ebermuth continued, "I'll send them to your house tonight. I have a couple of fellows in mind. They are loyal, trustworthy, and fierce." He gave Argolicus a salute, leaped on his horse, and rode down the street to catch up with his men. Okay, that's a section from the early beginning of the grain merchant, just as things are getting set up. And we meet Evermeth, and we're soon going to meet the two bodyguards. So I encourage you to back the story. It's an intriguing mystery with lots of intrigue and lots of action. And thank you for being here today. And I'll see you again.